it's kind of similar to how you were saying, like in school, you never, like your other teachers didn't really push you as much as you feel like they should. How, like, remember, like, when I would go to the office to turn in, like, the end of the year, like, to make sure I can go, like, on a school trip. And, like, how the lady was, like, shocked that in my old 4 years of high school, I had never been to detention. And how she was like, what? You never?
Suspended.
Or got suspended. And it's just kind of like, they knew me personally. Like, you kind of, how your counselors knew you. They knew I had good grades. They knew I wasn't a bad kid. Like, they never seen me in the office.
That's what African Americans do.
But they knew exactly who I was. They knew who you were. They knew you were my mom just because you were very present in, like, our school life. But even at the end of the year, she knew exactly who I was. But she's never seen me in the office. If it were to do something administrative or something like that, like what I was doing to get cleared for a school trip. But then she still felt the need to be like, oh, you never been to detention or suspended? And I'm like, there's a lot of my friends who have never been to detention or suspended who are black, but they just didn't. That low expectation then turns into, like, that's why a lot of kids, like, do, like, they don't feel the need that they need to do better in school, because people are always going to think that, like, well, they expect me to be in detention, so let me just be in detention if they expect me of it. But in light of that, this is the last quote that I want to share with you. It's the same chapter, so it's around, like, the same kind of concept. So here it is. It says, history has been so whitened by the white man that even the black professors have known little more than the most ignorant black man about the talents and rich civilizations and cultures of the black man of millenniums ago. So, if you would just like to reflect on that again.
Well, of course, we all know that history books and the way they present African Americans and Africans in general has been centered around not honoring our glory. So they take every opportunity to downplay, our accomplishments or our work that we put in building this country and the country that we had built in Africa. They don't want you to know that, because if you teach a man his glory, then you might get glorious things out of him. You might get big things out of him. He might have ideals. He might have big ideals. And if with his big ideal, he might communicate that in his language, through his knowledge, to his family, and then his family to his community, and displace them. And I think that's white fear. So white people have always been fearful of the educated black man and woman because their fear of being displaced or replaced, or flipping the script and us now doing what they've done to us to them. So, I mean, yeah, they've rewritten history books in their language, using their words, and they still continue to do it today. Just like they had the little article a while ago that said, the history book that said we migrated to America, as if we had some choice, like we just decided to come for a better life, So if they're still writing that today, and still to this day, we don't get much more than we were brought here on slave ships, we were slaves, then we were free, and then we had civil rights, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and that is it. What other great historian or contributor to African American life do we know about? It's like as if the world stopped after Martin Luther King and Malcolm X as far as leadership. It's like the world, we have leaders, but we do have leaders, but they don't want to write about it. They don't want us, that's not something they're interested in telling. And so we have to make sure we advance ourselves and our knowledge so that we tell our own stories to our kids.
Yeah. And I feel like, in a way, that's one advantage we have as a community, that in a way I feel like might start to be lost just with the new generation and how things are starting to come about, is that like we as family, like, you know, close family, we can tell these stories about like history that we've heard from just like, you know, small community gatherings, like small accomplishments from like cousins or family friends. Like we're able to tell those stories, but I think those are slowly starting to like fade away. And then it's kind of like, if you think hidden
No, they're there.
Yeah,
they're there. I mean, I guess it takes years down the line to look back at them. They're there, but when you let other people tell your stories and narrate for you, that's the bigger problem. It's not the story and the history. The history is there. They can't change the fact that we're kings and queens in Africa. They can't change the fact that they brought us here on slave ships. They can't change the fact of how they actually treated us. They could lie about it, and they do in a lot of cases. Fabricate it, yeah. You know, they could do all those things, but they can't change facts.
Yeah.
You know.
I think that's like why like a lot of people get shocked when we have movies like Hidden Figures. We're like, what? Yeah. We've never heard of these like 3 women who were a part of NASA, which is like, it's NASA. Like you don't even have to, you know, explain that. Or we get movies such as like kind of like The Help, but in a way those stories too are kind of portrayed in the perspective of white people, especially The Help, because, you know, just the idea of like, you know, the white savior and, oh, we only got to this point because a white lady, which is like, there's been debates on whether like it's based off a true story, which I don't think it is. I think it's based off the book. But even then, you're portraying like the stories of actual Black women who had to go in these households, and it's kind of like you still are telling their story from a white perspective, from like what you saw, like, oh, I came and helped, and like obviously like within that and like the language that history books show is kind of is really dangerous, because like as Black people, like we have our parents to be like, that's not really how it happened, let me tell you. But like white kids and what their parents, they don't have anyone unless they have close
they don't have that counter
people, to tell them. What they read is what they believe. And it's kind of like how I was telling you about the book Algorithms of Oppression. It's like, if I'm going to go and look up something like Black girls and I get Black girls are ratchet or something, or Black girls are ghetto, obviously I'm going to know like this is a systematic thing, this is bias. But someone who doesn't have that background, or a family member, or someone who is educated on bias just in the world, if they don't have anyone like that to tell them, or they haven't had any background education, they're only solely like expected to believe what they see. And I think that's kind of like how, in a way, language is dangerous, and like the words we use to describe Black people, how we tell stories about Black people, and sometimes they're not even stories, they're
how Black
false
people
narratives.
Sometimes tell stories about themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to hold ourselves accountable, because your lack of knowledge and your lack of ability to try to obtain it is just as horrible as letting white people tell your story. You know, when Black people, some of us start to buy into those same narratives, and it's just as bad. So,
you have any closing statements or anything you'd like to say?
On that one in particular,
or just in general?
I mean, as far as Malcolm X, I'm sure these were his early years, and I think he was just coming to the realization of self a little bit, and the Nation of Islam was kind of opening his eyes to what he would go on to, you know, realize later in his life and his direction, his trajectory, as far as where he thought African Americans should go. And he was only, he was a really big influence in that time period. He wasn't the only one. I think in that particular time period, he went on to be one of the three, what I think, one of the three choices that African Americans at that time had to make. It's like you could either be with maybe Martin Luther King and say, okay, we're going to do this peacefully. You can do Malcolm X and say by any means necessary, and black people need to develop themselves and not rely on what a white man is willing to give, the little crumbs that he's willing to give us, or you could do nothing. So those are like the three choices at the time that black people, African Americans, could make. You could do nothing and say that I'm just let's keep it the way it is. You could peacefully protest, or you could, on the last note, just go with Malcolm and say black people need to really come together for themselves, by themselves, which he kind of transformed as he grew more. But I think that was all of his seeking the true knowledge, and trying to pass that along. And that's the important thing. When you have language and you have knowledge, you can use it. You can transfer your ideals, your thoughts, your desires, not only to yourself, amongst your family, but to your community. Create change.